The train had barely stopped when Hattie Greer elbowed her way to the front of the platform and said it loud enough for everyone to hear. "Lord Almighty, they sent us a grandmother." Laughter broke across the platform like a wave, sharp, careless, the kind that doesn't apologize for itself. The man standing beside Hattie, a broad-shouldered rancher named Dale Pruitt, looked Margaret Ellison up and down with the same expression he might give a horse with a bad leg. He shook his head slowly, turned to the younger woman beside him, and offered his arm instead. "No offense to the lady," he said, loud enough. "But I wrote for a wife, not a housekeeper." More laughter. Someone near the back of the crowd muttered something about wasted postage. Margaret didn't flinch. She stood exactly where she was, one gloved hand resting on the handle of her weathered trunk, and let the noise wash past her like it was meant for someone else. If this story already has your attention, if something about that moment made your jaw tighten, then you're exactly who this story was made for. Hit that like button right now. Drop your city or country in the comments below so I can see just how far this tale is traveling, and subscribe if you haven't already. Because what happens to Margaret Ellison on this platform, and everything that unfolds after, is the kind of story you don't want to walk into halfway through. The afternoon was brutal in the particular way that late September on the Kansas prairie could be, the sun still carrying the arrogance of summer. Even as the shadows came long and early, the wind lifting fine dust off the platform boards and depositing it on every dress, every collar, every hopeful face that had stepped off the 315 from Abilene. There were 9 women on that train, 9 women who had answered advertisements placed in Eastern newspapers by men who needed partners more than they needed romance, though most of them had quietly hoped for a little of both. They had ridden 3 days across states that grew flatter and wider and emptier the further west the train carried them, and by the time the whistle blew for Caldwell Station, 7 of them had already made up their minds that they were doing the right thing. One was certain she had made a catastrophic mistake, and one, Margaret Ellison, was simply watching out the window with the calm attention of a woman who had learned not to decide how she felt about a place until she had stood in it a while. She was 56 years old. She had been a farmer's wife for 23 years, a widow for 4, and a woman entirely capable of managing her own affairs for longer than she could remember. She had answered the advertisement placed by one Gideon Hale of Caldwell County, not because she was desperate, and not because she was lonely in the way younger women meant when they used that word, but because she had looked at her remaining years with the honest arithmetic of someone who had survived enough to know exactly what she valued: company, purpose, land that still had work left in it. The letter from Gideon Hale had been straightforward. A man who wrote about his cattle the way some men wrote about their children, who mentioned his acreage before he mentioned himself, who said plainly that he wasn't looking for beauty as much as he was looking for someone who understood what hard seasons did to a household and didn't fall apart when they came. Margaret had read that letter 3 times. Then she had written back. They had exchanged 4 letters total. His were short, hers were precise. It had felt, in its own practical way, like the beginning of something reasonable, which was why she noticed, almost immediately upon stepping onto the platform, that something was wrong. The other women were being met. One by one, men moved through the small crowd with hats in their hands, and the particular stiffness of people trying to make good impressions, and names were called, and trunks were lifted, and the business of beginning new lives was conducted with varying degrees of warmth but consistent forward motion. Margaret watched it happen with no particular anxiety. She was a patient woman. She told herself Gideon Hale was simply late. She told herself that for the first half hour. By the time the last matched couple had climbed into a wagon and the station agent had retreated inside to his paperwork, the platform held only Margaret, her trunk, a young boy picking at a splinter in the platform railing, and the particular silence that follows a crowd. She sat down on her trunk. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked out at the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, and she gave herself exactly 5 minutes to feel whatever she was going to feel. She felt it. She recognized it. Then she set it aside. The first order of business was information. She picked up her trunk. It was heavy, but she was not fragile, and carried it the short distance to the station agent's window. "Excuse me," she said. "I was to be met by a man named Gideon Hale. Do you know of him?" The station agent was a thin man named Orville Sparks, who had been doing this job for 11 years and had witnessed enough of these situations to have developed an efficient sympathy. He looked at Margaret with the careful eyes of someone calculating how much to say. Know of him, yes, ma'am. And? Orville cleared his throat. Mr. Hale was here this morning, came in with some of the other fellows. There was some mix-up in the arrangement, I'd say. What kind of mix-up? Another throat clearing. Well, ma'am, he left with another woman, one of the others off your train. He paused. Miss Pauline Draper, from Cincinnati. Margaret absorbed this information with no visible reaction whatsoever. I see, she said. And was there any message left for me? No, ma'am. I'm afraid not. She stood there a moment, looking at Orville Sparks with eyes that were not particularly warm, but were also not particularly hostile, just deeply attentive, the kind of eyes that made people feel accurately seen in a way they weren't always comfortable with. Thank you, she said. She walked back to her trunk. She sat down on it again. She opened her traveling bag and withdrew a small notebook, which she opened to a blank page, and she began writing a list. This was when Dale Pruitt arrived. Dale Pruitt was one of those men who mistake confidence for character, who had built a personality out of the assumption that whatever he thought was probably worth saying. I was 44, well-fed, and had the look of a man who had been told he was funny often enough that he'd stopped trying to be. He had come back to the station for no particular reason, except that he'd left his hat on a peg inside and spotted Margaret through the window on his way back out. He came through the station door with 3 other men trailing him, ranchers from neighboring properties who had come to town for the bride train and were now hanging around in the way that men do when the day's main event is over but they're not ready to go home. Well, would you look at that, Dale said, loud enough to be performative about it. Somebody's grandmother is still waiting on the platform. The other men exchanged glances. 2 of them looked away. Margaret did not look up from her notebook. You writing your memoirs, darling? Dale continued, walking out onto the platform. He had his hat back on his head now, and his thumbs hooked in his belt, and the particular looseness of a man who doesn't expect to be checked. Or just making a list of all your regrets? Neither, Margaret said, without looking up. I'm making a list of my options. That got one of the other men, a quiet, bearded one named Roy, to turn his head slightly. The other 2 kept looking away. Dale laughed. Options, he repeated. Lady, your option was Gideon Hale, and Gideon Hale drove away with a woman about 30 years younger than you 3 hours ago. So whatever you've got on that list, I'd reconsider. Margaret finished the sentence she was writing. Then she looked up. She looked at Dale Pruitt with the same expression she had once used on a field hand who had told her, incorrectly, that the east fence couldn't be repaired before winter. Calm, precise, faintly unbothered. Do you have a point? She said. Or are you just passing the time? Silence. Roy, the bearded man, made a sound that he turned quickly into a cough. Dale's expression shifted, the particular recalibration of a man who had walked into something he hadn't expected. Just being friendly, he said, with less certainty. That doesn't appear to be what you're doing, Margaret replied. She looked back down at her notebook. If you have nothing useful to contribute, I'd appreciate the quiet. Dale opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the other men, who were now finding various pieces of the platform extremely interesting. He laughed once, the kind of laugh that means nothing except that someone doesn't know what else to do. And then he and his companions left, the door to the station swinging shut behind them. Margaret kept writing. Her list, when she reviewed it, contained 4 items. She could attempt to locate Gideon Hale and demand a proper explanation. She could find lodging in town and send correspondence to the other parties she had been in contact with back east. She could inquire about employment in Caldwell. Her skills were considerable, and she was not too proud to use them. Or she could simply buy a return ticket and go back to Ohio. She studied the 4th option for a long moment. Then she crossed it out. Whatever happened from here, she was not going backward. She was in the middle of this internal accounting when Hattie Greer came back to the station. Hattie was 29, round-cheeked, quick to smile, and had arrived that afternoon with such confident attractiveness that her matching up with a young rancher named Tom Sayers had taken approximately 4 minutes. She came back now with her bonnet in her hand, and the particular energy of someone who has just received good news and needs somewhere to put it. She spotted Margaret, and her expression shifted through several emotions quickly. Surprise, pity, something genuine underneath the pity. "Oh, you're still here," Hattie said. She sat down on the platform bench near Margaret's trunk with the easy familiarity of a woman who is comfortable with strangers. "I saw you from across the street. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Margaret said. "He didn't come for you," Hattie said. It wasn't a question. "No." "I heard." Hattie lowered her voice to the approximate level of someone discussing something serious. "Dale Pruitt told Tom Sayers that Gideon Hale saw your age on the registration card and went to the station master and asked for a different arrangement. Is that—" She stopped. "I'm sorry. That was probably not my place to say." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "How did that happen?" she asked. "The different arrangement." "I think the other girl, Miss Draper, had agreed to meet a man named Covey up north, but when Gideon Hale made his case to the station master, they just rearranged things. Apparently the station master is a friend of his." Hattie shook her head. "It wasn't right. I told Tom so." "No," Margaret agreed. "It wasn't right." She said this in the same tone she might use to observe that a fence post was leaning, accurate, factual, not particularly emotional. Hattie watched her with something like admiration, though she wasn't sure that was the right word. "What are you going to do?" "I haven't decided yet," Margaret said. "But I will." Hattie sat with her a while longer, and Margaret didn't mind the company, and they talked about small things: the length of the journey, the flatness of the land, the particular quality of western light, until Tom Sayers appeared across the street looking for his new wife, and Hattie squeezed Margaret's hand briefly and said, "I hope something good happens for you." And then she was gone. The platform was empty again. The sun was getting lower. Margaret stood up, straightened her back, and carried her trunk to the hotel across the street, which was called the Caldwell House, and had a lobby that smelled like wood smoke and boot leather. She arranged for a room, negotiated a weekly rate rather than a nightly one, because weekly was more economical, and she had no intention of leaving hastily, and went upstairs and unpacked her trunk with the methodical efficiency of a woman who had been keeping order in chaos for 30 years. She washed her face. She ate a quiet dinner in the hotel's small dining room. She went to bed. She did not sleep immediately. She lay in the unfamiliar dark and she let herself think honestly about what had happened. Not about Gideon Hale specifically. She had no investment in Gideon Hale as a person, had only 4 letters and a practical plan where a husband was supposed to be. What she thought about was the moment on the platform, when Dale Pruitt had laughed and the men had exchanged glances, and the particular sensation of being looked at as if you were a problem someone else had left behind. She had felt it before. She knew what it was. What she also knew, from considerable experience, was that the people who looked at her that way were almost always wrong about what they were seeing. She went to sleep on that thought, and she slept well. The next morning, she was eating breakfast in the hotel dining room, when the door opened and Orville Sparks from the station came in looking for her with the slightly harried expression of a man who had been asked to deliver a message he wasn't sure was welcome. "Mrs. Ellison," he said, coming to her table, "I apologize for interrupting your meal." "Sit down, Mr. Sparks," she said. "Have some coffee." He sat. He did not pour himself coffee. "I got a communication this morning," he said, "from Mr. Gideon Hale." Margaret set down her fork. "He's asking to meet with you," Orville said. "He came into town early this morning, came to the station first, actually, about 6 o'clock, before I was barely open. Said he needed to speak with you." Orville paused. He looked like he hadn't slept. "Did he say why he wanted to meet?" He said. Orville cleared his throat again, the same way he had the night before, the habit of a man who bought himself time with small sounds. "He said he owed you an apology and possibly a conversation, if you were willing. He asked me to deliver that message and said he'd wait at the feed store on 2nd Street for however long it took, or until you sent word you didn't want to see him." Margaret looked at her breakfast. She thought about the 4th item on her list, the one she'd crossed out. "Tell me something, Mr. Sparks," she said. "In your experience at that station, when a man drives away from the woman who came to meet him and then comes back the next morning saying he owes her an apology, what usually happens?" Orville thought about this with genuine seriousness. "Usually," he said slowly, "it goes one of 2 ways. Either he's looking for something easy, wants to clear his conscience and have done with it, or—" he paused, "or something happened out there on the road that changed his thinking. Which do you think this is?" Orville looked at her with the honest eyes of a man who had seen a lot pass through his station. "He came back," he said. "That's not nothing. Margaret considered this. Then she finished her breakfast. She found Gideon Hale at the feed store on 2nd Street, exactly where Orville had said he would be, sitting on the front step with his hat on his knee and the expression of a man who had been through something and was still deciding whether he'd come out the other side of it. He was large, larger than she'd expected from his letters, which had a certain contained quality, and his face had the particular weathering of someone who had spent decades in sun and wind and hadn't bothered much with shelter from either. He stood up when he saw her coming. He did not look relieved. He looked like a man who had made himself stand up because it was right, not because it was comfortable. "Mrs. Ellison," he said. "Mr. Hale," she said. He turned his hat in his hands. "I don't know where to start," he said. "The beginning is usually reliable," Margaret replied. Something moved across his face. It might have been the beginning of a smile, quickly suppressed. He looked at the ground, then back at her. "I did something yesterday that was wrong," he said. "I knew it was wrong while I was doing it, and I did it anyway, and I drove about 9 miles before I turned around." He stopped. "That's not me making excuses. That's me trying to tell you what kind of man you're actually dealing with." "What kind is that?" she asked. "The kind who knows better and sometimes doesn't do better," he said, "and who is trying to be honest about that so you can make an informed decision." Margaret looked at him steadily. "An informed decision about what?" He met her eyes. "About whether you're willing to come see the ranch." The silence between them had a particular quality to it, the weight of two people who have both lived long enough to be suspicious of easy things. "Not as a preliminary to anything," he added, "just as you traveled a long way. You deserve to see what you came out here for before you decide what you want to do." "And Miss Draper?" Margaret asked. Gideon's jaw tightened. "I drove her to the junction this morning. She's on her way to Covey's place, which is apparently where she was supposed to go originally." He paused. "She was fine with it. We had an honest talk on the road last night. She said she wasn't sure she wanted to be that far north anyway." "Did she know about me?" "By the end of the night she did," he said. "I'm not going to tell you she was happy about it, but she's honest too, and we worked through it." Margaret let the silence sit for another moment. Then she said, "Mr. Hale, I came to Kansas with a trunk and 4 letters and a plan that made sense on paper. The plan fell through before the sun went down. What I did not do was get back on the train." She held his gaze. "I'm still here. That tells you something about me. What you did yesterday tells me something about you. The question is whether both of those things add up to something workable." Gideon was quiet for a long moment. "Do you think they might?" he asked. "I think it merits a conversation," she said. "And a look at the ranch." He nodded. He reached down and picked up her traveling bag before she could object. Not gallantly, more like a reflex, the way a man reaches for something heavy without thinking. She let him carry it. They walked to his wagon without ceremony. He helped her up because the wagon was high and it was practical, not because he thought she couldn't manage. She noticed the distinction. As they drove out of Caldwell into the wide, flat country that opened up beyond the last building, she asked him about his cattle. He answered with the same directness he'd shown in his letters. She asked about the water supply, and he told her about the well situation honestly, including the part that was a problem. She asked about his books, who kept them, how current they were, and he gave her a sideways look that was either surprise or the beginning of respect. She couldn't quite tell. "You've run books before?" he asked. "For 23 years, she said. Farm accounts, crop planning, supply management. My husband was better with the livestock than the ledger. I handled the ledger." "What happened to the farm?" "He died. The boys took their shares and went separate ways, which was their right. I sold my portion and took a year to decide what I wanted to do with the remainder of my life." She looked at the horizon. This seemed like a reasonable answer. Writing a letter to a stranger in Kansas? Writing a letter to a man who knew what he needed and wasn't too proud to ask for it, she said. That's different from writing to a stranger. He thought about that for a while. About 4 miles out of town, they came over a low rise and the Hale Ranch spread out below them. Not grand, not glamorous, but solid in the way of things built to last rather than impress. The main house was 2 stories, newer than the barn, and the barn was older than it looked because someone had recently replaced the east-facing boards. She noticed that. She noticed the fence line running south, which was good, and the water trough placement, which was not ideal. She noticed the kitchen garden, which had been let go, and the condition of the yard, which was organized but overdue for some attention. She did not say any of this yet. She just looked. "It's not much," Gideon said. The statement was neither self-deprecating nor apologetic. It was just accurate. "It's enough to work with," Margaret said. He glanced at her. She was looking at the property with an expression he couldn't quite read, focused, calculating, but not cold, like someone doing serious math in their head and finding the answer interesting. "You really are different," he said. Not as a compliment exactly, more as an observation that surprised him. "From what?" she asked. "From what I expected," he said. "You expected someone younger," she said. It was not an accusation. "Yes," he said, simply and honestly. "Why?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Because I thought you meant more energy, more adaptability. Someone who could—" He stopped. "Grow into it," he said finally. "The ranch, the life. Grow into it with me." "And you thought age meant something fixed," Margaret said. "Already formed, less room." "Something like that." "You were wrong," she said. Not harshly, just factually. He pulled the wagon up in front of the house and wrapped the reins and sat there for a moment without getting down. "I'm starting to figure that out," he said. A ranch hand appeared from the direction of the barn, young, maybe 20, with the loose-limbed walk of someone still growing into his own height. He stopped when he saw Margaret in the wagon. "Mr. Hale," he said carefully. "I thought you were—" He glanced at Margaret. "This is Mrs. Ellison," Gideon said. "She'll be visiting today." The young man, his name was Pete, Margaret would learn later, looked at her with the frank appraisal of someone too young to be polite about it. Then something in her stillness must have registered, because he adjusted himself, straightened slightly, and said, "Ma'am," with more respect than he'd started with. "Pete," she said, because Gideon hadn't said his name yet. She had heard him called that by another hand who appeared briefly at the barn door. Pete blinked. "Yes, ma'am." "How long has that fence post been leaning?" She nodded toward the southwest corner, where a post had settled at an angle that was going to cause problems when the ground froze. Pete looked at the post, then at her, then at Gideon. "About 3 weeks," Pete admitted. "Fix it today," she said. "Before the weather changes." Another pause. Pete looked at Gideon again, and Gideon, to his credit, said nothing. He just waited. "Yes, ma'am," Pete said. And he went to get a post hole digger. Gideon climbed down from the wagon. He stood beside it and looked at Margaret, who was looking at the fence, already making her assessment. "You notice everything?" he said. "I've been noticing things for 56 years, she said. "It would be strange if I'd stopped by now." She climbed down from the wagon. She didn't wait for help. She had her own rhythm. And she walked toward the house, and Gideon Hale watched her go with the expression of a man just beginning to understand the nature of his good fortune and still not entirely sure how to hold it. She stopped at the front door and turned back to look at him. "Are you going to show me the rest of this place?" she said. "Or are you just going to stand there?" He moved, and they went inside. And the afternoon light was still going when Margaret asked him to show her the accounts, and he brought out 3 ledger books, and she sat down at the kitchen table and opened the first one, and neither of them said anything for a long time, and that was, in its own particular way, the beginning of everything. The ledger books were a disaster. Not dramatically so. Not the kind of disaster that announced itself with red ink and crossed-out numbers. The kind that was worse, actually. The quiet, creeping disaster of a man who understood cattle well and accounting poorly, who had kept records the way someone keeps a messy drawer, knowing roughly what was in there but unable to find anything specific when it mattered. Margaret worked through the first book without comment for nearly 40 minutes, while Gideon sat across the table from her doing the thing men do when someone is examining their work, shifting in his chair, refilling his coffee, finding small tasks for his hands that didn't require him to leave the room. Finally, she looked up. "When did you last know exactly what this ranch was worth?" she asked. Gideon thought about it. "When my father was alive," he said. "He had a head for figures. I don't." "You know that about yourself." "Doesn't help much when the books still need keeping." "No," she agreed, "it doesn't." She turned another page. "You've been overpaying for feed. Whoever sold you the Harmon contract in—" She checked the date. 1881 charged you 12% above the county rate, and you've been renewing it without renegotiating. Gideon went very still. "How do you know the county rate?" I asked Mr. Orville Sparks this morning while I was waiting. He mentioned the grain cooperative. I asked what their standard rate was. She looked at him. Information is free, Mr. Hale. Most people just don't think to ask for it. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable exactly, but it had weight to it. The particular weight of a man recalibrating what he thought he knew about a situation. That contract comes up for renewal in November, he said slowly. Then you have 6 weeks to research your alternatives and negotiate from a position of knowledge rather than habit. She closed the ledger. I'd suggest starting with the cooperative directly. They may not volunteer a better rate, but they won't refuse to discuss one if you ask correctly. And how do you ask correctly? You bring your numbers, she said, and you don't apologize for having them. Gideon looked at her across the table with an expression that had shifted considerably from the one he'd worn that morning at the feed store, the guilty, stiff-shouldered look of a man delivering unwelcome news to himself. This was something else, something that had more questions in it. Why did you answer my letter? He asked. Specifically mine, you must have had other options. I had 3 letters, she said. Yours was the only one that mentioned the land before it mentioned the writer. That told me something about your priorities. What did it tell you? That you were serious, she said. That you were building something, not performing something. She paused. The other 2 letters mentioned their looks. One of them mentioned his humor. That's fine for a dance partner. I wasn't looking for a dance partner. Something loosened slightly in Gideon's face. Not a smile, Mub. He wasn't a man who moved to smiling quickly, but a relaxation around his eyes that meant he was less braced than he'd been. What were you looking for? Margaret considered the question with the honesty it deserved. Partnership, she said. The functional kind. Someone who needed what I could offer and had something to offer back. She looked around the kitchen, at the good bones of the house, the neglected corners, the window that faced east and would get good morning light. This place has potential. Anyone can see that. What it needs is someone paying attention to the right things. And you think that someone is you? I think it might be, she said. But I haven't decided yet, and neither have you, and we should both be honest about that. He nodded, slowly. The way men nod when they respect something they weren't expecting to respect. The sound of boots on the porch boards broke the moment. Pete coming around from the side, visible through the kitchen window, dragging a fence post behind him with the determined effort of a young man who'd been given a direct instruction by someone whose authority he hadn't entirely sorted out yet. Margaret watched him for a moment. How many hands do you have? She asked. 3 full-time. Pete and 2 older men, Cass and Whitmore. 2 more I bring in for drives and heavy season work. Cass and Whitmore. How long have they been with you? Cass, 11 years. Whitmore, 6. And Pete? 8 months. He came up from Texas with a recommendation from a man I trust. He's good with horses, still learning cattle. He listens, Margaret said. That matters more than knowing cattle at 20. You can teach a person who listens. Gideon studied her. You assessed all of that from one exchange on the yard. He corrected his posture when he realized he'd been impolite, she said. That's not something you can fake at his age. It either comes from good raising or genuine self-awareness, and either one is useful. Outside, Pete was digging. The sound of it came through the window in rhythmic pulses. Margaret stood and moved to the window and looked at the angle he was working at, and she could see from across the yard that he had the post braced correctly, which was more than some men twice his age would manage. Show me the barn, she said. Gideon took her through the property the way a man shows something he's responsible for, not hiding the weak points, but not leading with them either. The barn was sound, better than it looked from outside. The cattle pen was adequate for current numbers, but would need expansion if he planned to grow the herd, which he did. The storage was organized by someone who thought in spatial terms rather than categories, which meant it was efficient for access and inefficient for inventory. Margaret noted all of it without writing anything down, which Gideon eventually found more unsettling than if she'd had a notebook. You're going to remember all of that? He asked, as they stood at the far end of the property, looking back at the main house. I've been running mental inventories since I was 32, she said. My husband used to say I had a storage room in my head and everything in it was labeled. Was he right? Mostly, she said. I misfile things occasionally, usually when I'm tired or worried. She looked at the house, the east window in the bedroom, the big one on the 2nd floor. Is that the room you sleep in? He looked at her sidelong. Yes. That window needs new rope in the sash. It won't stay up on its own. I noticed it from outside, the way the sash sits. She paused. It's a small thing, but small things in a house are how you know if someone's been paying attention. No one's been paying attention, he said, and there was something honest and slightly defeated in it. No one with the right eyes, she corrected. That's different. They were walking back towards the house when they heard the wagon coming up the lane. Not Gideon's wagon, a different one, moving faster than lane traffic warranted. Margaret and Gideon both stopped and turned. The man driving it was broad and florid-faced and wore a jacket that was expensive for this county, and a hat that didn't quite fit his head, and he pulled the horse up harder than necessary and climbed down with the air of someone accustomed to arrivals being events. "Hail," he said. Not hello, not how do. Just the name, like a stamp. Gideon's jaw moved. Chester. Chester Drum was, Margaret learned quickly, from the way Gideon's entire posture shifted, not a welcome visitor. He was the kind of man who owned things adjacent to things you owned and was always looking for opportunities to own yours as well. He had a property 2 miles east and a reputation in Caldwell County that people described carefully, choosing their words the way you'd choose your footing in uncertain ground. Chester looked at Margaret with undisguised assessment, not the lascivious kind, the commercial kind, which was somehow more invasive. "Who's this?" he said. "Margaret Ellison," Gideon said. "She's a guest." "Guest," Chester repeated, the way men repeat words when they mean something else. He tipped his hat to her, the gesture technically polite, the execution of it not. "Chester Drum. I own the Drum property east of here. Perhaps you've heard of it." "I arrived in Caldwell yesterday," Margaret said. "I haven't heard of much yet." Chester smiled. It was a perfectly serviceable smile that somehow failed to reach any part of his face that wasn't his mouth. "Gideon, I came to talk about the Henderson parcel." Something went through Gideon's expression, brief, controlled, gone in a second. But Margaret caught it. "Not today, Chester," Gideon said. "I've been patient," Chester said. 6 months of patient. Henderson's heirs are ready to settle, and if you're not moving, I need to know so I can move myself." "I said not today." Chester looked at Margaret again. The smile shifted slightly. "I see you've got company." "Well." He turned back to Gideon. "I'll come by Thursday. Have an answer ready." He climbed back into his wagon with the same performative efficiency with which he'd arrived, and the lane dust settled slowly behind him as he drove away. Margaret watched the wagon go. "The Henderson parcel," she said. Gideon said nothing for a moment. Then, "Land that adjoins mine to the north. Old man Henderson died in the spring. His 2 sons are back east and want to sell. And you want to buy it." "I've wanted to buy it for 3 years. Henderson wouldn't sell while he was alive. He was stubborn, and we had history. But his boys don't have any attachment to it. They just want the cash. And Chester Drum wants it too." "Chester Drum wants everything that touches his land," Gideon said. His voice was flat in the way that meant the flatness was doing work, holding something back that wasn't worth letting out. "He's been buying up parcels for 2 years. Every time a neighbor goes under or moves on, Drum's there with cash and a fast handshake. He got the Mallory place last fall, the Breckett farm in the spring." "How much is the Henderson parcel?" Gideon looked at her. He was doing the calculation. How much to say to a woman he'd known for a day? Then something in her expression must have settled it, because he told her. The price was fair, maybe slightly below fair. The problem was that Gideon had tied up cash in a machinery purchase in August, a decision that had made sense at the time and was now making things tight in a way he hadn't anticipated. He needed 4 months to free up the right amount without damaging the ranch's operating position. "And Drum doesn't need 4 months," Margaret said. "Drum can write a bank draft tomorrow," Gideon said. "He's been liquid for 2 years specifically because he saw this kind of opportunity coming. He's not impulsive, I'll give him that. He's been building toward something and he knows exactly what he's doing." "What does he want with all of it?" "The adjoining land." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Cattle empire is the charitable version. He wants to run more cattle than anyone in this county and control the eastern grazing corridor all the way to the river. If he gets Henderson's parcel, he'll have a continuous line from his main property to the water. And you'll be enclosed on 2 sides. And I'll be enclosed on 2 sides, he confirmed. They stood there in the afternoon light, and Margaret thought about the ledger books on the kitchen table. and the feed contract that was costing him 12% more than it should, and the fence post that had been leaning for 3 weeks, and the books that showed a ranch that was solid but operating with less precision than it could be. "Let me look at the accounts again," she said. "Why?" "Because there may be room you haven't found yet," she said. "People who don't have a head for figures usually leave room in their books without knowing it. Not fraud, just inefficiency. Money that's going somewhere it doesn't need to go." He looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon was going golden around them, the way it did in Kansas at this time of year. Not the aggressive gold of summer, but something quieter and more serious, the light that means things are changing. "All right," he said. They went back inside. She spent 2 hours with those ledger books. Gideon sat with her for the first hour, answering questions, and then Cass came to the door with a problem about a calf that needed attention, and Gideon excused himself and went out, and Margaret kept working alone at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold and a stub of pencil that she'd found in her traveling bag. When Gideon came back in, his shirt had blood on the cuff from the calf situation, and he looked tired in the particular way of physical work, which is different from the tired of worry, though they can compound each other terribly. He looked at what Margaret had spread across the table. 3 ledgers open, a separate piece of paper with figures on it in her careful handwriting, and an expression on her face that he was beginning to recognize as her thinking face, which was not exactly warm but was absolutely focused. "What did you find?" he asked. $14 a month in supply orders that are duplicated," she said. "You're ordering from 2 different suppliers for overlapping goods, and neither one is giving you a volume discount because neither one knows you're splitting the order. Consolidate to one supplier and negotiate a standing order discount. Conservatively, you save $8 to $10 monthly." Gideon sat down. "That's $100 a year." "Roughly. There's also a property tax assessment from 2 years ago that you overpaid by $31 and never corrected. That's a matter of going to the county office with the original assessment document and the payment receipt and asking for the adjustment. It won't fix the Henderson situation, but it's $31 that belongs to you." He looked at the figures she'd written. "You found all this in 2 hours." "The information was in your books," she said. "I just read them." She paused. "The Henderson situation, though, the supply savings are too slow and the tax correction is too small. The gap is still significant." "I know," he said. "Is there collateral you haven't considered? Something you could secure a short-term note against?" He was quiet. Then, "There's the equipment I bought in August. New machinery. It's fully paid and in good condition." "Who holds it?" "It's mine outright." "Then it can be collateralized," she said. "A short-term note against equipment at a reasonable rate through a bank you've dealt with honestly. 6 months. Maybe 8. Long enough to liquidate the position correctly and pay it back without touching your operating funds." She looked at him. "Have you worked with the Caldwell Bank long enough that they know your payment history?" 12 years, he said. "Then you have something Chester Drum doesn't have," she said. "You have history with people who trust you. That's worth a conversation." Gideon stared at the figures for a moment longer. Then he looked up at her, and the expression on his face was something that she did not try to name because she was practical about these things. But it was the expression of a man who has just understood something that changes the shape of a problem he thought was fixed. "Why are you doing this?" he said. "You don't owe me anything. What I did yesterday was wrong," she said simply. "Yes, and you came back and you told the truth about it, and that's what makes the conversation possible." She closed the ledger nearest to her. "I'm doing this because it interests me, because the problem is real and the solution is findable, and I'm good at this. And because—" She paused, and this was the only moment she allowed herself something that might be called personal. "I didn't come all the way to Kansas to go back to Ohio." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, Pete had finished with the fence post and was putting tools away. The sound of it came through the window, metal on wood, purposeful and ordinary. "Stay for supper," Gideon said. It was not a romantic proposition. It was said the way you offer something to someone who has been working in your house and probably hasn't eaten since morning, directly, practically, without decoration. "All right," Margaret said. Supper was beans and cornbread, which Gideon cooked himself with the competent inelegance of a man who has been cooking for himself long enough to do it adequately, but never enthusiastically. Pete ate with them at the kitchen table because there was no formal arrangement for where the hands ate, and this had apparently evolved over time into the current casual system. Pete was quiet through most of the meal, answering when addressed, not volunteering, watching Margaret with the furtive assessment of someone trying to categorize a new thing in his world. Finally, over the last of the cornbread, he said, "Ma'am, where'd you learn about fence posts?" "From watching them fail at inconvenient times," Margaret said. Pete nodded slowly. "My father said you learn more from things breaking than things working." "Your father was right," she said. Pete glanced at Gideon in a way that communicated something, some shift in his internal accounting, some adjustment of a position he'd held. Gideon caught it and said nothing. After supper, Gideon drove Margaret back to Caldwell in the early dark, the prairie going purple and then black around them, the stars coming out with the aggressive abundance that only happened far from cities. Margaret rode without talking for a while, which was not a tense silence but a settled one, the kind you can only have with someone whose company you've tested enough to trust a little. "The bank," she said, as the lights of Caldwell came into view. "Who do you work with there?" "A man named Aldous. He's been manager for 8 years. "Go see him before Thursday," she said. "Don't wait for Drum's visit to be the thing that forces the conversation. You want to walk into Thursday knowing what your options are, not looking for them." "You think I have a real chance at the Henderson parcel?" "I think you have a better chance than you had this morning," she said. "Which is something." He pulled up in front of the Caldwell house and set the brake. The light from the hotel lobby fell out across the dirt of the street in a warm yellow square. He sat there a moment without getting down. "I'd like you to come back tomorrow," he said. "If you're willing. There are things I'd like to show you that I didn't get to today." "What things?" "The North grazing land, the Henderson parcel border, the water situation, which is more complicated than I made it sound." He paused. "And I'd like to know what you think of the house itself, the layout, whether it's livable for someone who's used to running a household." Margaret looked at the hotel lobby, then at Gideon. 8 o'clock, she said. "I'll be here at 7:30, he said. She climbed down from the wagon. He did not leave immediately. She could hear the wagon still standing there as she went up the hotel steps. She did not look back. Inside, at the small writing desk in her room, she opened her notebook and looked at the list she'd made the previous afternoon. The 4 options. She had crossed out the 4th one. Now she drew a faint line through the 2nd and 3rd as well, which left the 1st. Attempt to locate Gideon Hale and demand a proper explanation. She considered that, and then she wrote one additional word beneath the remaining option. "Done," she wrote. She closed the notebook and prepared for bed, and she lay in the dark again for a while, and this time the thoughts were different. They were not about humiliation or dislocation. They were practical thoughts, focused and moving forward. The cattle numbers and the ledger inefficiencies, and the Henderson parcel, and Chester Drum's liquid assets, and the way Gideon had said 12 years when she asked about the bank, with the quiet certainty of a man describing something he'd built carefully. She thought about Pete digging the fence post correctly without being told how. She thought about the east-facing bedroom window that wouldn't stay up. She thought about what it meant to build something in the remaining years of a life, and whether this difficult, imperfect, entirely unromantic beginning had the right materials in it. She thought it might. Outside, the Kansas wind moved through the street and rattled the hotel windows in their frames, and Margaret Ellison lay in the middle of a plan still forming and did not find that frightening at all. In the morning, Gideon was at the Caldwell house at 7:20. Margaret was already downstairs. I was there at 7:20, and she was already at the small table near the lobby window with a cup of coffee and her notebook open, writing something in the careful hand that he was coming to recognize as her working hand, the one she used when she was thinking about something real, not just passing time on paper. She looked up when he came through the door and did not appear surprised to see him early. "Coffee," she said. "The hotel serves it in the dining room. It's passable." "I've had mine," he said. "You ready?" "I've been ready," she said, and closed the notebook. They drove out in the early morning, the light still thin and colorless the way October light was before the sun got any height to it, the prairie grass bent flat by a wind coming out of the northwest that had a different character than the wind of the previous days. Margaret noticed it. She did not say anything about it yet, but she turned her face into it once and then settled back against the wagon seat with a particular stillness that meant she'd registered something and filed it. Gideon took her north first, which was where the Henderson parcel began. He pulled up at the fence line that marked the boundary, and they sat there in the wagon looking at it. Flat land, same as everything else out here, but with good grass cover and a natural low point that collected water from the surrounding terrain, which meant it would hold moisture through dry periods better than higher ground. That depression there, Margaret said, it holds water naturally? Spring through late summer, mostly. By October it's usually dry, but the ground stays soft longer than the surrounding land. Come hard winter, that's grazing you can access earlier in the year. What's the soil composition? He looked at her. I don't know the technical name for it. Deep and dark. Good for grass. Henderson ran cattle on it? Sheep, mostly. That was part of why we had history. I run cattle and he ran sheep, and we disagreed about the fence line responsibility for about a decade. Gideon's mouth tightened slightly with the memory. He was a difficult man, but he managed that land well. I'll give him that. Margaret climbed down from the wagon without asking and walked to the fence line and crouched near a corner post, examining it. The post was solid. Henderson had maintained his fences better than some. She stood up and looked east, following the fence line with her eyes to where it eventually bent and disappeared over a low rise. How far does it go that direction? She asked. About 1.5 miles to the creek, Gideon said. The eastern border runs along the creek for maybe half a mile, then cuts back north to the road. And Drum's land is on the other side of that creek? On the east bank, yes. She turned and looked at Gideon. If he gets this parcel, his land surrounds yours on the east and north both. That's correct. And the water access? The creek runs through Henderson's parcel before it gets to mine. If Drum controls both banks... He stopped. He did not need to finish it. Margaret looked at the fence line for another moment. Then she walked back to the wagon and climbed in. Take me to see Aldous, she said. Gideon turned to look at her. The banker? You were going to go before Thursday, she said. It's Tuesday morning. Go now. Today. While I'm here. Why while you're here? She considered how to answer that with honesty and not arrogance. Because I can help you present the case, she said. And because 2 people sitting across from a banker look more like a plan than 1 person sitting alone does. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Something moved through his expression. Not offense, she noted, but something more complicated. A man deciding how much help to accept and from whom and on what terms. We're not, he started. I know what we are, she said. We are 2 people who have had honest conversations for 1 day and who share a practical interest in this property situation. That's what I'll present to Aldous if he asks. That's also the truth. She looked at him steadily. You can go alone if you prefer. No, he said after a moment. Come. They went back to Caldwell. The bank opened at 9 and it was 1:15 when they arrived, so they sat in the wagon outside for a few minutes, and Margaret used that time to ask Gideon questions, specific questions, the kind that would come up in a banker's conversation, about payment history and current debt position and the monthly operating costs of the ranch. He answered all of them, some with ease and some with the discomfort of a man who knows the answer but doesn't enjoy saying it out loud. She listened without judgment. She just needed the numbers. Inside, the Caldwell Savings and Trust was a small building that smelled like paper and machine oil and had a ceiling that was lower than it should have been for a bank, which gave the whole space a slightly compressed feeling, as if the business inside was being conducted under mild but constant pressure. Aldous Manning was a compact man in his mid-50s with the careful grooming of someone who understood that appearance communicated solvency in his line of work. He greeted Gideon with the warmth of 12 years of reliable transactions. Not effusive, but real. Then he looked at Margaret. This is Mrs. Ellison, Gideon said. She's been reviewing my accounts. Aldous looked at her with the practiced assessment of a man who evaluated things for a living. In what capacity, may I ask? A practical one, Margaret said. She sat down in the chair across from his desk without waiting to be invited, which seemed to recalibrate Aldous' expectations slightly. Mr. Hale is considering a land acquisition that would strengthen his northern position considerably and prevent a competitor from enclosing 2 of his borders. The timing is tight. I'd like to understand what options exist for a short-term collateralized note against his August equipment purchase. Aldous blinked. Then he looked at Gideon. She always talk like this? She talks like this, Gideon confirmed. Aldous settled back in his chair with the expression of a man who has just decided this meeting is going to be more interesting than he anticipated. "All right, Mrs. Ellison," he said, "tell me what you're thinking." The conversation that followed was 40 minutes long and covered ground that Gideon could not have covered alone. Not because he lacked intelligence, but because he lacked the vocabulary of finance that Margaret had developed over 2 decades of managing a farm's books, through floods and droughts and bad seasons and the particular cruelty of commodity price swings. She spoke Aldous' language and Aldous knew it, and he responded to it the way people respond when someone speaks their language correctly, with openness, with professional respect, with a willingness to discuss terms rather than just decline politely. By the end of the conversation, Aldous had outlined a 6-month note at acceptable interest, collateralized against the equipment, with a payment schedule that worked against the ranch's monthly income without cutting into operating minimums. It was not everything Gideon needed, but combined with the supply savings Margaret had identified and the tax correction, it was enough. It was enough to make an offer on the Henderson parcel before Chester Drum could. Walking out of the bank into the October morning, Gideon did not say anything for a moment. They walked to the wagon and he stood there with his hand on the side rail, and Margaret waited while he worked through whatever he was working through. "I've been coming to that bank for 12 years, he said. "I know. And I never—" He stopped. "I never walked out of there with that much clarity about what my actual position was." "You never had someone who'd looked at your book sitting beside you," she said. "No," he said. "I hadn't." He looked at her. "You know what you did in there?" "I helped you present your situation accurately," she said. "The decision was his. The creditworthiness was yours. I just—" "Margaret," he said. It was the first time he had used her first name, and they both noticed it, and neither of them made anything of it. "Thank you." She nodded once. That was all. They drove back toward the ranch, and the wind was picking up by the time they reached the property, coming harder out of the northwest now, with a cold edge to it that was different from October cold. Margaret looked at the sky to the northwest, which had gone from pale gray to a color that was almost yellow at the horizon. "When did your last hard weather come?" she asked. "Usually not until November," Gideon said. "I was watching the horizon too now." "Why?" "That sky," she said. He looked. His expression changed. Not panic, but a recognition that moved quickly from observation to calculation. He had grown up on this land, and he knew what that color meant. "It's too early," he said, almost to himself. "Weather doesn't keep a calendar," Margaret said. He pushed the horse a little faster. When they reached the ranch, Cass was already in the yard with the look of a man who has been watching the same sky and has been watching it longer. Cass was 61, lean and weathered and permanent-looking, the kind of man who had been shaped by 30 years of hard outdoor work into something that could withstand considerable force. He had 3 fingers missing from his left hand from a roping accident years back and wore this the way some men wear medals, without drama, but without hiding it either. "See the northwest?" Cass said. "I see it," Gideon said. "Whitmore's already moving the horses to the back barn," Cass said. "Pete's checking the cattle pen gates." He looked at Margaret with the calm, unsentimental eyes of a man deciding whether she was useful or in the way. "You know weather?" "I know Kansas weather is not the same as Ohio weather," she said. "But I know what to do before a hard storm. What do you need first?" Cass looked at her for a moment longer. Then he nodded toward the storage barn. "There's supply crating that needs to move inside. It's stacked on the south side of the barn. 3 of us can move it in about an hour if we don't waste time." "Then let's not waste time," she said, and walked toward the barn, and Cass fell in beside her with the easy adjustment of a man who knew how to work alongside other people without having to negotiate about it. The next several hours were the kind that strip away everything that isn't essential. The wind came up fast and cold, and by early afternoon it was cutting across the yard with enough force to make conversation difficult unless you turned your back to it. Margaret worked with Cass on the supply crating while Gideon and Pete moved livestock, and Whitmore reinforced the barn doors with additional bracing that should have been installed before this season but hadn't been. She was stronger than people expected. She was also efficient in the way of someone who had done physical work for decades. Not fast exactly, but economical. No wasted movements. No adjusting and readjusting the grip. Cass noticed this without commenting on it. He just worked alongside her and matched his pace to hers without condescension, which was the highest form of respect she knew. "You were a farm wife," Cass said, between loads. "For 23 years, she said. "What kind of farm?" "Grain and some cattle, Ohio River Valley. We had wet springs and dry summers, and I've seen maybe 4 storms in my life that came as fast as this one is coming." "This one's going to be bad," Cass said. There was no alarm in it. It was just the statement of a man who knew what he was seeing. "How bad is bad for this region?" "If it's what I think it is, early cold snap with moisture behind it. We lose fence posts if they're not set deep. We lose cattle if they're not sheltered. We lose 2 or 3 weeks of good grazing if the ground freezes hard." He loaded another crate and straightened. "Last time we had one like this was 6 years ago. Gideon lost 14 head. Margaret absorbed this. What did he do wrong? Cass looked at her. The question was not unkind, just direct. "He tried to drive the cattle too far before the storm hit, instead of sheltering them where they were," Cass said. "By the time he got the herd to the main pasture, the wind was at 20 miles and the cattle were exhausted and the shelter wasn't ready." He paused. "He knows better now. Mostly." "Mostly?" Margaret repeated. "He's planning to ride out and bring in the north herd," Cass said. 30 cattle on the Henderson border. He'll want to move them to the lower pasture before this hits." "How long would that take?" "Hour each way, maybe more if the cattle are spread. And the storm..." Cass looked northwest. The sky was darker now, the yellow-gray of something serious building behind it. "The storm won't wait 2 hours." Margaret thought for a moment. "Where are the cattle now?" "Mostly in the hollow below the north fence. It's natural shelter, low ground, grass on 3 sides." "If they're already in the hollow, they're already partially sheltered," she said. "If the hollow doesn't flood," Cass said, "if the moisture comes in as rain before it turns to ice, the hollow fills. We've seen it." "What's the probability?" Cass studied the sky again. 50-50. Maybe 60-40 against flooding. It's cold enough that it'll probably come straight as ice instead of rain first. Then the cattle are better in the hollow than in transit during the storm. "That's my read," Cass said. "But Gideon won't leave them up there without checking." Margaret looked at the house, where Gideon had gone to change into heavier gear 20 minutes ago. "I'll talk to him," she said. Cass looked at her with something she didn't try to name. "All right," he said. Inside, Gideon was pulling on his heaviest coat, the kind of gear that meant he intended to be outside in serious weather for a serious amount of time. He had his saddlebags out and was loading them with the practical items of a man preparing for cold outdoor work when Margaret came through the kitchen door. "Cass thinks they're better in the hollow," she said. "Cass isn't responsible for them," Gideon said. "No, you are. Which means this decision is yours." She stood in the kitchen doorway. "But I want to lay it out as I see it, and then I'll leave it alone." He looked at her. "Go ahead." "The hollow is natural shelter. If it stays cold and the moisture comes as ice instead of rain, the cattle stay dry and protected, and the hollow acts exactly the way it's supposed to. The risk is flooding if it comes as rain first. Cass estimates that risk at maybe 40%, she paused. If you ride out now, you're in transit with 30 cattle for up to 2 hours while that storm comes in. In transit is the worst place to be with cattle in a fast storm. They panic, they split, you spend the storm chasing them instead of being here where the other 200 head need attention. Gideon stopped loading the saddlebag. I was looking at the floor, not at her, but he was listening. The Henderson parcel border, she said. The hollow is on your side of the fence? Yes. Then it's ground, you know. Cass knows it. Pete could ride out partway to check the status and come back with a report before you commit to bringing them in. You'd make the decision with current information instead of making it now with the information you have. The kitchen was quiet. The wind pushed against the windows. Pete's young, Gideon said. Pete is 20 and grew up riding in Texas and can read weather and takes direction, Margaret said. Send him to the hollow, have him assess, and come back. 15 minutes each way. By the time he's back, you'll know what you're dealing with. Gideon stood there for a moment longer. Then he put down the saddlebag. Pete, he called out toward the yard. Pete appeared in the back doorway within 30 seconds, which meant he'd been close enough to hear the conversation or close enough to the house that the call reached him immediately. He looked at Gideon and then at Margaret. Ride to the North Hollow, Gideon said. Don't push the horse. Look at what the cattle are doing and look at the ground around the hollow. I need to know if there's any standing water or if it's dry. Come back and tell me. Don't try to move them yourself. Just look and come back." "Yes, sir," Pete said. He was gone in under a minute. Margaret went back out to help Whitmore with the barn door bracing. Gideon came out behind her and worked on the water trough covers, getting them weighted down so the wind couldn't take them. Cass moved methodically through the storage area, making final checks with the efficiency of someone who had done this before and knew exactly where the weaknesses were. They worked in the wind, which was now a consistent and insistent force, and nobody talked much because the wind made talking unpleasant, and also because there was nothing to say that wasn't already being done. Pete was back in 22 minutes. "Hollow's dry," he said, breathing harder from the ride. "Ground is solid. Cattle are bunched at the south end of it, which is the wind-protected side. They're not distressed, they're just standing together the way they do. The grass at the hollow's edge is pressed flat from the wind, but the hollow itself is calm compared to the open ground." Gideon listened to this with his arms crossed against the cold. "Standing water anywhere near the inlet?" "None," Pete said. "I walked the inlet side. The ground was hard." Gideon looked at the sky. He was quiet for 10 seconds, which felt longer in the wind. "All right," he said. "We leave them." He looked at Cass. "I want someone to check them every 3 hours through the night." "I'll take the first check," Cass said. "Whitmore takes the middle. Pete takes morning." Pete nodded. "I want the south barn ready as backup if the hollow floods," Gideon said. "Cass, can we fit 30 additional head in the south barn if we need to?" "Tight, but yes," Cass said. "I'll move the supply crating to the north storage." "Do it." The afternoon moved into evening fast because the storm was eating the daylight. By 5 o'clock it was dark as 7, and the temperature had dropped 12 degrees since noon. The wind had stopped gusting and started blowing steady, which was its own kind of worse because steady wind at this temperature was serious business that intended to stay. Margaret was in the kitchen when the first ice hit the windows. Not snow, ice, tiny hard pellets that sounded like someone throwing sand against the glass. She heard it and felt something settle in her chest, the particular sensation of an outcome arriving that you'd been calculating and couldn't fully control. Gideon came in from the yard, his coat rigid with cold, his face red. He stood in the kitchen and shed his outer gear with the economic speed of someone too cold to take their time about it. "It's ice," he said. "I heard," she said. "Sit down, there's coffee." He sat. She poured. The kitchen was warm. She had stoked the stove an hour ago, not because anyone had asked her to, but because she could see the temperature dropping and knew what a warm room would mean to a man coming in from that cold. He wrapped both hands around the mug. He didn't say anything for a moment. "The cattle," he said finally. "We'll be fine," she said, with more certainty than she fully had, because certainty is sometimes what a person needs, even when it's not entirely earned. "Cass goes out at 8. By then we'll know more." "If the hollow floods?" "The hollow is dry and the ground is frozen, and ice doesn't pool the way rain does," she said. "Cass is experienced and the south barn is ready. You have a plan for every contingency. That's all you can have." He looked at her across the kitchen table. The ice hit the windows in gusts, ticking, relentless, the sound of a serious situation doing exactly what serious situations do. "I'm glad you're here," he said. It was a simple statement, not weighted with anything she didn't want it to carry, just the honest acknowledgement of a man who had worked through a hard afternoon alongside someone useful and knew it. "I'm not going anywhere tonight," she said. "The hotel can wait." He nodded. He did not make anything of it. Neither did she. Cass came in at 8:15 from the first cattle check with ice crystals on his mustache and the short, factual report of a man who did not embellish. Cattle were settled, hollow was dry, temperatures were sustainable, no flooding, no distress. Gideon received this information with the particular exhale of someone releasing a tension they've been holding for hours. "Good," he said. "Get warm." Cass got warm. Whitmore came in at midnight with the same report. Hollow dry, cattle calm, storm steady, but not intensifying. Pete went out at 4 in the morning and came back with stiff fingers and the news that the ice had stopped around 3 and the temperature had leveled off at the kind of cold that was serious but not catastrophic. Through all of it, Margaret stayed. She slept a few hours on the kitchen bench, which was not comfortable but was adequate, and she kept the stove stoked and the coffee available, and she answered Gideon's questions when he had them, which were frequent through the night, and she did not make the mistake of treating his anxiety as weakness. She treated it as the natural response of a responsible man to a situation he could not fully control, which is what it was. In the morning, the real morning, gray and still after the storm, the ice lying across the grass in a thin sheet that caught the pale light and turned it, Gideon went out with Cass to do a full property assessment. Margaret went with them. The main damage was to two fence sections on the north side. Posts that hadn't been set deep enough had heaved in the freeze, tilting the line at angles that needed immediate correction. One of the barn door hinges had cracked from the cold expansion and would need a blacksmith's attention within the week. The water trough on the east side had ice in it that needed breaking. The cattle were fine, all of them, including the 30 in the hollow. Gideon stood at the hollow's edge and looked at the herd, which was moving again now that the storm had passed, and he stood there long enough that Cass and Margaret gave him space for it. "Last time," he said, when Margaret came to stand beside him, "I lost 14. "I know," she said. "Cass told me." He looked at the herd. "Different choices," he said. "Different information," she said. "Pete gave you current information. That's what made it a different decision." He was quiet. "The fence posts on the north line," she said, they need to go deeper. Not just resetting the heaved ones, all of them on the north and northwest face before the next hard freeze. That's probably 3 weeks. "I know," he said, "and the barn hinge needs a blacksmith before it fails completely. If that door comes off in the next storm—" "I know, Margaret." She stopped. He was smiling, which was still a rare enough occurrence that it changed his whole face when it happened. Not broadly, just a slight relaxation of everything that was usually held tight. But it was genuine. "I know," he said again, more quietly. "I'm just—" He looked at the herd. "I'm making a list." She looked at him, and she felt for the first time since the train platform the particular sensation of standing in the right place at the right moment. Not triumphant, nothing as large as that, but accurate. The sensation of something fitting the way a well-set post fits in solid ground. "Good," she said. "Then let's go fix what we can fix today and make a plan for the rest." They walked back up from the hollow together, and Cass was already at the fence line with a post hole digger, because Cass was the kind of man who didn't wait to be told. And Pete was breaking ice from the water trough, with the steady rhythm of someone doing necessary work without complaint, and the damaged hinge barn door stood at an angle that needed attention. And there was a full day of hard and necessary things ahead of them. And Margaret Ellison walked through the morning with the particular purpose of someone who has stopped being a visitor and started being something else, though neither she nor Gideon had put a name to it yet. Some things didn't need a name to be real. Chester Drum arrived on Thursday exactly when he said he would, which told Margaret something about him. That he was the kind of man who used punctuality as a form of pressure, who wanted you to know he kept his word on small things, so you'd believe he was reliable on large ones. She was in the kitchen when his wagon came up the lane. She had been there since 7 that morning, working through a revised set of projections based on the supply consolidation and the equipment note terms Aldous had outlined. The storm aftermath had taken 2 days of hard physical work to address. The fence posts, the barn hinge, a section of roof on the smaller outbuilding that had lifted at one corner from the wind. And through all of it, Margaret had been present, not as an observer, but as someone doing the work alongside whoever needed an extra pair of hands. By Wednesday evening, Gideon had stopped suggesting she rest and started simply telling her what needed doing next, which she took as the more honest form of respect. She heard the wagon and looked out the kitchen window and saw Chester Drum climbing down with his too expensive jacket and his poorly fitted hat, and she watched him survey the yard with the proprietary gaze of a man already calculating ownership. Gideon was at the barn. Pete went to get him. Margaret stayed in the kitchen. She was still in the kitchen when Gideon and Chester came through the front of the house and into the sitting room, which was the room where Gideon conducted anything that might be called business, though it was also just the room with the better chairs. She could hear them clearly through the open kitchen doorway. "You've had your 3 days," Chester said. "I have," Gideon said. "So what's your answer?" A pause. "I'm making an offer on the Henderson parcel." The silence that followed was the kind that has shape to it, Chester Drum processing something he hadn't expected, rearranging his approach. "You don't have the liquidity," Chester said. His voice was patient, the patience of a man who has done his research. "I know what your August equipment purchase cost. I know what your current operating position is. You don't have the cash to move on Henderson right now. I'm not moving on it with cash, Gideon said. Another pause. The bank, Chester said. It was not a question. Aldous and I have an arrangement. Chester made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Gideon, you've got a collateralized note against depreciating equipment, against a parcel that's going to cost you more than you think to integrate into your current operation. You're putting yourself underwater to block me. I'm putting myself in a position to grow the ranch, Gideon said. You're overextending, Chester said. His voice had shifted, still controlled, but with an edge that had not been there before. And you know it. Let me make you a different proposition. I'm listening. Let me buy the Henderson parcel. I'll pay you a finder's commission, 5%, for bringing it to my attention before the heirs settled with a broker. And I'll guarantee a right-of-way across the northern border so your cattle still have creek access. He paused. You come out ahead without the debt, and you keep your water. In the kitchen, Margaret set down her pencil. A right-of-way, Gideon repeated. Written and recorded, Chester said. I'm not trying to take your water, Gideon. I'm trying to build something here, and I need that northern corridor. The right-of-way protects you. For how long? 20 years. And after 20 years? Silence. And after 20 years? Gideon said again. I'm back to having a neighbor who controls 2 of my borders and the creek access, and whatever right-of-way he decides to honor at that point. That's a long time from now, Chester said. A lot changes in 20 years. It is, Gideon said, which is why I'm not making decisions now based on conditions that might not hold for 20. Chester's voice went flatter. You're making a mistake. Maybe, Gideon said. It'll be my mistake. The sitting room went quiet. Margaret heard Chester stand, the specific sound of a large man getting up from a chair that wasn't quite solid enough for his frame. There are other ways this could go, Chester said. The words were measured, careful, the kind of careful that means something is being communicated that isn't being said directly. I expect there are, Gideon said. Was there anything else? The front door opened and closed. Margaret listened to the wagon pull out of the yard, and then she picked up her pencil and went back to the projections. And Gideon came into the kitchen a few minutes later and poured himself a cup of coffee that he didn't drink immediately, just held, looking out the window in the direction Chester's wagon had gone. He's going to make it difficult, Gideon said. He's going to try, Margaret said. There's a difference. Not always. Usually, she said, men like Chester Drum are powerful because people believe they're inevitable. The moment you stop believing that, his options narrow considerably. She looked up from her work. You held your position well. I almost didn't, Gideon said. She looked at him. The right-of-way offer, he said. For about 15 seconds, I thought it was a reasonable compromise. He turned from the window. And then I thought about what you said, that after 20 years, the right-of-way is whatever he decides it is. What made you think of it? You, he said simply. I've been thinking about things differently for 3 days. Margaret looked back at her papers to give him room not to elaborate, because she understood that some admissions were easier when the other person didn't lean into them. The Henderson parcel offer went to the heir's attorney that same afternoon, carried by Aldous Manning, who had the credibility of an established bank behind him and the correctly structured financing that made it real. The Henderson boys were in Chicago and wanted a clean and quick transaction. Gideon's offer was not the highest possible price they could get, but it was documented, it was backed, and it would close within 30 days. Chester Drum made a counteroffer 2 days later. Higher number, faster cash. The Henderson attorney sent a message to both parties requesting final offers by end of the following week. It was during this waiting period that Margaret moved from the Caldwell House Hotel to the Hale Ranch. It happened without ceremony and without any explicit conversation about what it meant, which was exactly how Margaret preferred significant things to happen. Organically, because the situation required it, not because something had been declared. The practical fact was that her daily presence at the ranch had made the hotel room an expensive redundancy. The practical fact was also that Gideon had a spare bedroom on the second floor, and that Pete had mentioned to Cass, who had mentioned in passing within earshot of Gideon, that it didn't make sense to keep driving back and forth to town every evening. Gideon mentioned it to Margaret the way he mentioned most things, directly, without ornamentation. There's a room upstairs, he said, the south one. It has a good window. If you'd rather stay in town, I understand, but you're here every day anyway, and the roads are going to get worse before spring. What would people say? She asked. Not because she was particularly worried about it, but because it was a practical consideration that needed acknowledging. He thought about it with the same seriousness he gave practical considerations. They'll say what they say, he said. Cass and Whitmore and Pete are here. It's a working household. Anyone who's actually been out here knows what the arrangement is. And anyone who hasn't been out here? Will have an opinion regardless, he said. People like Dale Pruitt are going to find something to say about you one way or another. Might as well give them something accurate to work with. Margaret had looked at him for a moment. All right, she said. She moved her trunk from the Caldwell house on a Friday morning, and Pete carried it upstairs without being asked, and Whitmore made a point of showing her where the extra lamp oil was kept. And Cass said nothing at all except to move his hat when she came through the kitchen, which from Cass was the equivalent of a formal welcome. The south room had a window that faced the open pasture, and at night, when the lamp was out and the room was dark, she could see the stars over the flat land with a clarity that Ohio had never offered, the horizon being so much closer there, so much interrupted by trees and hills and the particular crowdedness of a long-settled place. This was different. This was wide and cold and indifferent in the way that wide places are, and she found, to her own mild surprise, that she didn't mind it. She minded less each day. The Henderson decision came back on a Wednesday. Gideon got the letter from the attorney and read it at the kitchen table with Margaret across from him going through the month's revised supply accounts, and she knew by the way he went still that it was either very good or very bad. They accepted, he said. She looked up. Our offer, he said. They accepted our offer. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Outside, Cass was working somewhere. The sound of it came in faintly, rhythmic, ordinary. Why? She asked. Chester's was higher. Attorney's letter says the heirs wanted a clean close, Gideon said, still reading. Drum's financing came with conditions. He wanted an extended survey and an environmental assessment on the creek boundary. That pushed his close date out by 3 months. He set the letter down. We close in 30 days, clean. Margaret looked at the letter. Chester tried to slow it down to renegotiate, she said. That's what it looks like. He underestimated how much those heirs wanted this finished, she said. They're in Chicago. They have lives there. They don't want to be managing a Kansas land sale for another 3 months. No, Gideon said. They don't. He looked at her. You thought of the quick close angle. I suggested it to Aldous, she said. The 30-day commitment was deliberate. I told him to make the timeline part of the offer's value. Gideon was quiet for a moment. When did you do that? Tuesday, when you were at the fence line with Cass. She met his eyes. I should have told you. He thought about this. She could see him working through it, a man who was accustomed to making his own decisions, assessing what it meant that someone had made one on his behalf without telling him first. Was it the right call? He asked. It worked, she said. That's not the same thing as whether it was right. Was it? She considered it honestly. Yes, she said. I believe it was, but I should have told you before I told Aldous. That was my error. He nodded slowly. Don't do that again, he said. It was not angry, it was just clear. I won't, she said, equally clear. The conversation sat there between them for a moment, not uncomfortable, but honest. The kind of moment that actually builds something, even when it isn't pleasant. Thank you, he said then, for the close strategy, even though you should have told me. You're welcome, she said, even though I should have told you. Something moved across his face. It might have been the beginning of a laugh, suppressed out of long habit. Chester Drum came back. Not in person, not directly. He came back through other channels, the way men do when direct confrontation hasn't worked. He started with the feed supplier. The Harmon feed contract that Margaret had identified as overpriced was up for renegotiation in November, and Gideon had already begun the process of approaching the grain cooperative as an alternative. What he discovered in the second week of November was that Chester Drum had gotten there first, had gone to the cooperative board, and offered them a consolidated supply contract covering all 5 of his properties, a volume that made Gideon's single ranch account look like a rounding error by comparison. The cooperative was not hostile. They were just honest, Drum's business was worth 3 times Gideon's, and if it came to choosing between them, the math was straightforward. Pete brought this news from town on a Tuesday, looking uncomfortable the way young men look when they've been asked to deliver something they didn't want to carry. Mr. Drum was at the cooperative Tuesday morning, Pete said. I heard it from Roy Sims, who was there for his own account. He said Drum spent an hour with the board, and they were shaking hands when he left. Gideon absorbed this at the kitchen table. Margaret was there. Cass was at the doorway. He moved fast, Gideon said. He knew we were going to the cooperative, Margaret said. He figured it out from the Henderson offer strategy. Once he knew we were working ahead of him, he started working ahead of us. How do we respond? Gideon asked. We don't fight him on volume, Margaret said. We can't. His volume is real, and we can't match it. She thought for a moment. The cooperative wants reliable business. Volume is one dimension of reliable. But there's another. Consistency of payment, length of relationship, the cost of switching suppliers mid-season. We've been buying from Harmon, Gideon said. And you can keep buying from Harmon, she said. Renegotiate with Harmon directly instead of going through the cooperative. Harmon knows you, knows your payment history, and would rather renegotiate terms than lose a 12-year account. She paused. Drum assumed you'd abandon Harmon for the cooperative's prices. If you don't, his play doesn't actually affect you. Cass spoke from the doorway. That assumes Harmon renegotiates. Yes, Margaret said. It assumes that. She looked at Gideon. Do you have a relationship with Harmon personally? Not just the account. The man. His son and I went to school together, Gideon said. Then go see him, she said. Not a letter. In person. Tell him you want to renegotiate the rate, and you'd rather do it with him than take your account elsewhere. Men with history respond to conversations differently than they respond to letters. Gideon went to see Harmon the next morning. He came back that afternoon with a revised rate, not as low as the cooperative's published price, but within acceptable distance of it, and with a handshake that Gideon trusted more than he'd trust Chester Drum's written contract. What did you say to him? Margaret asked. I told him I'd been overpaying for 3 years and I'd rather fix it between us than go find someone else to fix it with, Gideon said. And he said? He said he'd been wondering when I was going to notice. Gideon set his hat on the hook by the door. He's known the rate was above county average. He didn't volunteer it because I never asked. Nobody does, Margaret said. That's not dishonesty. That's just business. I know, Gideon said. He sat down at the table. I don't like it, but I know. Chester's next move came from a direction none of them had anticipated. It came through the county tax assessor's office, in the form of a reassessment notice for the Hale Ranch property that arrived in the second week of November, citing a review of comparable sales in the area, specifically the Henderson parcel transaction, that suggested the current assessment was below market value. The proposed new assessment increased Gideon's annual tax burden by 31%. He read the notice 3 times before he brought it to Margaret. When he put it on the table in front of her, she read it once, and then she looked at the date it was filed, and then she looked at the assessor's name at the bottom. Ronald Pitts, she said. Do you know him? To see him, Gideon said. He's been assessor for 4 years, appointed by the county commission. Who's on the county commission? Gideon looked at her. Something was working behind his eyes. 3 members. Harlan Burke, a man named Suter, and... He stopped. And, Margaret said. Chester Drum, Gideon said. Chester's been on the county commission for 2 years. The kitchen was very quiet. He can't direct the assessor to target a specific property, Gideon said. But he didn't sound certain. Not directly, Margaret said. But the assessor serves at the pleasure of the commission, and a commission member who mentions that the Henderson transaction suggests a review of adjacent properties. She set the notice down. It's not illegal, it's pressure. That's a 31% increase, Gideon said. I know. On top of the equipment note, on top of the feed renegotiation cost differential, on top of... He stopped. He was doing the math in his head, and it was clearly not adding up the way he needed it to. I know, Margaret said again. She picked up the notice and read it through a second time more slowly. The assessment cites comparable sales. That means it's based on a methodology, which means it can be challenged on methodological grounds. How? The Henderson sale was a distressed sale, she said slowly. The heirs were remote, motivated to close quickly, and accepted below full market value to get it done. Using that transaction as a comparable for a working, established ranch with a different property profile is methodologically weak. She set the notice down. I need to see the original assessment documentation and the Henderson sale price, which should be public record, and the last 3 assessments for comparable Caldwell County properties. Where would you get all of that? The county records office, she said, which is public. Anyone can request it. She looked at him. I'm going to Caldwell tomorrow. Margaret, I know what I'm doing, she said. I've challenged a tax assessment before. In Ohio, after my husband died, the county tried to reassess the farm at estate value rather than operating value. I contested it. She paused. I won. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. You've done this before. A version of it, she said. The principles are the same. What do you need from me? The original deed on this property. Any previous assessment notices you still have, at least the last 2, and the closing documents on the Henderson purchase when they're finalized next week. She picked up her pencil. And some time. He got up and went to the small office off the sitting room, a room she'd been in briefly but not worked in, and she heard him going through papers, the particular sound of a man who kept things but didn't always know where he'd put them. I was back in 20 minutes with a folder of documents that were organized the way his ledger books had been organized, roughly, functionally, but not precisely. She took the folder. She spent that evening and most of the following day at the county records office in Caldwell, and the clerk there, a young woman named Ada, who was clearly accustomed to people not being sure what they wanted, found Margaret's specificity refreshing enough that she pulled documents with real efficiency and even, by the afternoon, began to anticipate what Margaret was going to ask for next. What Margaret assembled over those 2 days was a picture. The picture showed that the Hale Ranch's previous 2 assessments had been conservative, closer to 65% of operating market value, which was typical for working cattle properties in Caldwell County, where the assessment custom had long been to value working land at below full market to keep operations viable. The Henderson sale was anomalous, a quick transaction on sheep grazing land in a period of peak cattle prices, which made it fundamentally incomparable to an established cattle operation. And the picture showed something else. 3 other properties adjacent to Chester Drum's holdings had received similar reassessment notices in the past 18 months. 2 of them had simply paid the increased amount. 1 had contested it and withdrawn the contest 3 months later. Margaret went to see that 3rd property owner. His name was Elias Crum, and he ran a small sheep operation 2 miles south of Drum's main property. He was 67 and had the exhausted patience of a man who had been fighting something for a long time and had recently decided to stop fighting. She found him in his yard on a Thursday afternoon, mending harness with the mechanical focus of someone who needed his hands busy. Mr. Crum, she said, my name is Margaret Ellison. I'm working with Gideon Hale. Crum looked up. He had the eyes of a man who had been surprised unpleasantly too many times to react quickly to anything new. Hale, he said. He's received a reassessment notice, she said. I believe you received something similar 18 months ago. Crum went back to the harness. I don't talk about that. I'm not asking you to testify to anything or sign anything, she said. I'm asking whether your experience with the assessment process gave you any information that might help someone else navigate it. He worked the harness for a moment. You contesting it? He asked. Yes. Who's doing the contesting, Hale or you? Both of us, she said. He has the standing. I have the documentation. Crum looked at her again, more carefully this time. You're not from here, he said. Ohio, she said. I've been here 6 weeks. He made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh. 6 weeks and you're already contesting a county assessment. Someone has to, she said. He set down the harness and looked at his property, at the modest, careful work of a man who had maintained something for decades under increasing pressure. When I contested mine, he said slowly, the assessor's office told me the reassessment was based on updated methodology. They were very polite about it, very procedural. He paused. 3 weeks after I filed the contest, my south water line was cut, on Drum's side of the fence. I couldn't prove anything. I fixed it and dropped the contest. The yard was quiet. Wind moved through the dry grass at the fence line. I'm sorry that happened, Margaret said. It happens, he said. That's what Chester Drum counts on, that things happen and people get tired. Do you still have your original contest filing? She asked. And the correspondence from the assessor's office? He looked at her for a long moment. Why? Because 3 contested assessments in 18 months on properties adjacent to the same landowner's holdings creates a pattern, she said. A pattern is different from a single incident. A single incident is something you weather. A pattern is something a county commission has to respond to. Crum was quiet for a long time. The wind pushed across the yard. Somewhere a gate was moving, tapping against its post in the irregular rhythm of something that needed latching. I'll look for the papers, he said finally. I'm not promising anything else. That's all I'm asking, she said. She drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon, and Gideon was at the barn when she arrived, and he could tell from the way she got down from the wagon, not quickly, not slowly, just with purpose, that she had found something worth finding. Crum, she said when he came across the yard. He had a contested assessment 18 months ago. He withdrew it after his water line was cut. Gideon went very still. There may be one other property with a similar story, she said. I'm going to find out tomorrow. She looked at him steadily. If there's a pattern here, documented with filing records, we can take it to the commission directly. Not just contest our assessment, challenge the methodology systematically. The commission includes Chester Drum, Gideon said. The commission includes 2 other members, she said. Harlan Burke and Suter. Do you know them? Burke runs a hardware concern in town. Suter farms east of here. Wheat, mostly. They're not Chester's people. They vote with him sometimes because he's loud and organized, and they're not because they owe him anything. Then they might listen, Margaret said, if what we bring them is facts, and not just one man's grievance against another. Gideon looked at her in the fading afternoon light. When did you figure all this out? I didn't figure it out, she said. I'm still figuring it out. I need 1 more day of records and 1 more conversation, and then I'll know whether we have something or whether we have a story that's only almost true, which is useless. And if it's useless, then we contest the assessment on its own merits, which are weak on their side and strong on ours, and we probably win the contest and pay higher fees while we wait, and Chester Drum learns to be more creative next time. She picked up her bag. But I don't think it's useless. She went inside. Gideon stood in the yard for a moment, looking at the land around him, at the property that had been his father's and was now his, that would either remain his or be slowly pressed into impossibility by a man who understood the mechanics of pressure and had the patience to apply them steadily. Then he went inside too, because the kitchen light was on and supper needed making and there was work to do tomorrow and the day after, and that was when everything else was stripped away, the shape of a life that was worth defending. Cass passed him at the door, coming in from the barn. She'll get it sorted, Cass said. Not cheerfully. Just as fact, the way Cass stated things, he'd assessed and concluded. Gideon looked at him. You think so? Cass took off his hat. I've worked for 3 different outfits, he said. I've worked for men who knew what they were doing, and men who thought they did, and men who had no idea and were lucky. He hung his hat on the peg. I've never worked for a woman before. And? Gideon said. Cass thought about it for a moment. She looks at a problem like it's something she's going to solve, he said. Not something she's going to survive. There's a difference. He moved toward the stove. I'll make the beans. Gideon stood in the doorway a moment longer. From upstairs came the sound of Margaret moving in the south room, the specific sound of someone settling into work, the quiet, purposeful sounds of a person who knew what they were doing and was doing it. He went to help Cass with the beans. The second property owner's name was Frank Della, and he ran 60 acres of mixed grain and cattle on the western edge of Drum's expanding territory. And he was not difficult to find because everyone in Caldwell County knew where Frank Della lived. He had been there for 31 years and had no intention of being anywhere else, which was precisely what made his situation so instructive. Margaret found him on a Friday morning, 2 days after her conversation with Elias Crum. He was loading feed sacks into a barn that had seen better decades, working with the steady, joyless efficiency of a man who had learned not to think too hard about the condition of things he couldn't afford to fix. He was 58, broad-shouldered, and had the particular look of someone who had been carrying something heavy for long enough that it had changed his posture. He listened to Margaret without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she finished explaining what she was looking for, he leaned against the barn door and looked at the ground for a moment. My assessment came 14 months ago, he said. 24% increase. I didn't contest it. Why not? Because I talked to Crumb first, he said, and I heard what happened to his water line. And I've got 2 daughters and a wife in that house, and I wasn't going to have something happen to our water line. He looked at her directly. I'm not ashamed of that decision. I'd make it again. I understand, Margaret said. And she did. She meant it without reservation, because she understood exactly what it meant to make the calculation he had made, the one where you weighed your principles against your family's safety, and found that the principles, however correct, were not worth what they might cost the people you were responsible for. What I need to know, she said, is whether you still have the assessment notice, and whether you'd allow me to make a copy of it. He looked at her. What are you going to do with it? I'm going to show a pattern to 2 members of a county commission, she said. Burke and Suter. I'm not going to use your name in anything public. I need the document as evidence of the pattern, not as testimony from you personally. Frank Della thought about this for a long moment. The barn behind him smelled of hay and old wood, and the particular dusty warmth of livestock sheltered against the autumn cold. If you use it and Drum finds out it came from me, he said slowly. The next thing that happens won't be a water line. I know, she said. I'm asking you to trust my discretion. I can't promise you nothing goes wrong. I can promise you I'll do everything I can to present this in a way that doesn't point back to you. He was quiet for another moment. Then he went into the house and came back with a folded paper and handed it to her without saying anything else about it. She took it, thanked him, and left. Driving back toward Caldwell, she held the 3 documents in her mind. Her own assessment notice, Crumb's withdrawn contest, Della's unfought increase. And she laid them against each other the way you lay pieces of evidence against each other when you're trying to determine whether what you have is a case or just a coincidence. 3 properties, 3 assessment increases, all adjacent to Chester Drum's holdings, all within 20 months. There was a pattern. She was certain of it. What she was less certain about was whether Harlan Burke and Suter would see it the same way, or whether they would see a woman they didn't know presenting documents against a man they had served alongside for 2 years, and decide that the safer thing was to do nothing. She stopped at the county records office before going back to the ranch and asked Ada for one more set of documents, the assessment histories on Chester Drum's own 5 properties, going back 5 years. Ada found them in 20 minutes. Margaret looked at them at the clerk's counter without sitting down, running her finger down the columns of figures. Chester Drum's own assessments had not increased in 4 years. In fact, 2 of his properties had been reassessed downward in the same period that his neighbors' taxes were going up. She copied the relevant figures into her notebook, thanked Ada, and went to find Gideon. He was at the ranch when she arrived, in the middle of a conversation with Cass about the Henderson parcel integration. Specifically, which section of fencing to address first, and whether the natural water collection in the hollow could be improved with minimal intervention. She waited at the kitchen table until they finished, and when Gideon came inside and saw her face, he pulled out a chair and sat down without preamble. She laid it out for him. Everything. Crumb's notice and the water line, Della's calculation and his silence. The assessment histories showing Drum's own taxes declining while adjacent properties increased. The timeline, the pattern, the methodology argument. Gideon listened without moving. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. His own taxes went down, he said. Twice, she said, while 4 of his neighbors went up. That's not a coincidence, he said. No, she said. It's not. She folded her hands on the table. I want to go to Burke, not the full commission. Just Burke. Privately, before any formal filing. I want to show him what I've found and give him the opportunity to respond as a reasonable man before this becomes a formal complaint. Why Burke first? Because he's the one most likely to be embarrassed by what Drum has been doing rather than implicated in it, she said. If he knew, he's complicit. If he didn't know, he's been made to look foolish on his own commission. Either way, he has more reason to act than Drum has reason to stop him. Gideon was quiet for another moment. What if he's not reasonable? Then we file a formal complaint with the state assessor's office, which bypasses the county commission entirely, she said. I looked into it this afternoon. There's a state-level oversight process for county assessment disputes that cites systematic bias. It takes longer and it's more public, but it removes the local pressure. More public, Gideon said. Chester Drum doesn't want public, she said. His whole method has been quiet pressure, incremental, hard to point to specifically, easy to explain away individually. The moment this becomes a documented public complaint to a state office, it changes the nature of what he's doing. He's not just a county commissioner with opinions about assessment methodology. He's a named party in a formal complaint about using public office to benefit himself financially. Gideon looked at the documents on the table. You've been thinking about this for 2 days. I've been thinking about this since I saw the pattern in Crumb's situation, she said. I wanted to be sure before I said it. Are you sure now? She met his eyes. As sure as the documents allow, she said, which is the only kind of sure that means anything. He thought for a long moment. Go see Burke, he said. I'll come with you. You don't need to. I know I don't need to, he said. I'm coming. They went to see Harlan Burks on a Saturday morning, which was when his hardware store was open and he was predictably behind the counter, because Burke was the kind of man who showed up to his own business reliably, which was both a virtue and the reason his wife managed most of their social affairs. He was in his early 60s, heavy-set, with a manner that was neither warm nor cold but fundamentally fair, the manner of a man who had spent decades selling people things they needed and had learned to read a situation without getting ahead of it. He looked at Gideon when they came in, and then at Margaret, and then at the folder Margaret was carrying. Gideon, he said. Harlan, Gideon said. This is Margaret Ellison. She's been helping me with my accounts. Burke looked at her with the same careful assessment she was becoming used to from Caldwell County men. I've heard of you, he said. The woman from the train. That's me, she said. What can I do for you, he said. He said it to both of them, which was fair. We'd like 15 minutes of your time, Margaret said, privately, if possible. He called his clerk to the counter and took them to the back room, which smelled of raw wood and metal and the oiled paper smell of hardware goods stored in quantity. He sat on a stool and they stood, because there was only one stool, and Margaret opened the folder. She was precise and she was fast. She did not editorialize. She laid the assessment notices side by side and walked Burke through the dates, the percentages, the property relationships to Drum's holdings. And then she showed him the Drum assessment histories, the declines, the timing, the pattern that emerged when you put everything on one table and looked at it without the excuse of individual coincidence. Burke did not speak during any of this. He looked at each document as she placed it, and he had the expression of a man who was doing arithmetic he had not expected to find unpleasant. When she finished, he sat with it for a moment. Where did you get Della's notice? He asked. From Della, she said, with the understanding that his name wouldn't be used in anything public. And Crumb's contest filing? Crumb gave me permission to use the document, she said, not his testimony. Burke looked at Drum's assessment history again. He picked it up and read the numbers a second time, slowly, the way you reread something you're hoping will say something different. Pitts does the assessments, Burke said. The commission approves them as a block, usually. We don't review each one individually. I know, Margaret said. That's how this is possible. Burke looked at Gideon. Did you know about any of this when it was happening to Crum and Della? No, Gideon said. Neither did I, Burke said. He said it in a way that made clear he was not asking to be believed. He was simply stating his position so it was on record in the room. He set the document down. What do you want? Our assessment withdrawn and reset at the previous methodology, Margaret said. The same corrective review applied to the Crum and Della assessments, and a formal commission review of Pitts's methodology over the past 3 years, which I would expect to show that the pattern extends beyond these 3 properties. Burke looked at her for a long moment. You're asking me to open an investigation into my own commission. I'm asking you to correct a problem that exists in your commission, she said. The difference matters. One is an attack. The other is oversight doing what oversight is supposed to do. Burke was quiet for a long moment. If I don't, he said, not threateningly, just factually, you go to the state office. Yes, she said, and that becomes public. Yes. He looked at the documents one more time, then he looked at Gideon. You trust her judgment on this? He asked. More than my own on this kind of thing, Gideon said, which was an honest answer, and they both knew it. Burke nodded slowly. Leave me copies, he said. I need to talk to Suter, and I'll need to talk to Pitts. He paused. Chester's going to know. Chester already knows we're not going away, Gideon said. This just formalizes it. Burke picked up the copies Margaret had already prepared. She had brought them because she had expected this outcome, and he held them with the careful grip of a man who understood he was now holding something that had weight. "Give me 2 weeks," he said. The 2 weeks were not quiet. Chester Drum came to the ranch on the Monday of the first week, and this time he came without the performance of punctuality or the expensive jacket. He came in work clothes, which somehow made him more unsettling than he'd been before. The suggestion that he was no longer in the phase where appearances mattered. Margaret was in the kitchen. Gideon was in the yard. She watched through the window. The conversation was too far to hear, but she could read the body language with the accuracy of someone who had spent a lifetime watching people communicate things they wouldn't say directly. Chester was controlled, but the control was work. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way he held his hands. Gideon was not backing up. He stood where he stood and let Chester talk and did not fill the pauses with the nervous accommodation that Chester was probably accustomed to producing in people. Chester left after 12 minutes. He did not look toward the kitchen window, but Margaret had the distinct impression he knew she was in it. Cass came in through the back door 10 minutes later. "He offered to buy the ranch," Cass said. "He said it the way he said everything, just as information, the way you report weather." Margaret looked up. "The whole ranch?" "Full price," he said. "Fair market. Gideon can walk away whole." Cass hung up his coat. Gideon told him no. How did Chester take that? Cass considered. "Quietly," he said. "That's the part I didn't like." Margaret went back to her work, but she kept the information in the front of her mind for the rest of the day, turning it the way you turn a problem that has changed shape without yet revealing what shape it's become. The quiet lasted 4 days. On Friday of the first week, Pete came in from checking the north fence, the Henderson border, newly theirs, that they had been integrating with methodical care, and reported that someone had opened 3 gate latches on the northeast section. The cattle hadn't drifted far. Nothing was lost. But the latches didn't open themselves. Gideon repaired and reinforced the latches and said nothing to anyone outside the ranch. On Tuesday of the second week, someone left a dead animal, a sheep, not one of theirs, at the entrance to the lane. It was the kind of thing that could be anything, a coincidence, a sick animal that had wandered and died, someone's dark sense of purpose. It was also the kind of thing that was designed to be all of those simultaneously, so that the person doing it could always claim the first explanation. Gideon disposed of it without discussion. Margaret watched him do it, and she watched the way he held himself through those 2 weeks. Not afraid, but careful. Careful the way a man is careful when he knows he is being watched and is determined not to give the watcher anything useful. "He's testing whether you'll break," she said that evening. "I know," Gideon said. "He expects you to come to him, to negotiate, to decide the whole thing is too much trouble." "I know," Gideon said again. "Are you going to?" He looked at her across the kitchen table, and his expression was the one she'd come to know best. Not the guarded one he'd worn on the day they met, not the grateful one he'd worn after the Henderson close, but the straightforward one, the one that meant he was just being accurate. "No," he said. She nodded. "Are you?" he asked. It was the first time he had asked her something like that. The first time he'd acknowledged, directly, that she had skin in this. That what was happening to his ranch was also happening to her in some way, because she was here, and she had made the decision to be here, and that decision had consequences. "No," she said. "I'm not." The 2 weeks ended on a Wednesday, when Harlan Burke came to the ranch without sending word ahead. He arrived mid-morning in a plain wagon with Suter beside him, which meant he had brought a witness or a second opinion, and either way it meant he was treating this as something official. They sat in the sitting room, Gideon and Margaret across from them. "Pitts," Burke said, "has resigned from the assessor's office. He submitted his resignation Monday morning." He paused. "He cited personal reasons. We accepted it." "What happened to him?" Gideon asked. "He's leaving the county," Burke said. "His choice. We didn't compel it." He glanced at Suter, who nodded slightly, confirming the account. "The commission has agreed to a full review of assessments filed in the past 3 years. Properties that show increases significantly above the county average and adjacent to single-owner expansion will be reviewed individually against the standard methodology." "Drum's properties as well?" Margaret asked. Burke looked at her. "The review applies to all properties," he said, "without exception." "And our assessment?" Gideon said. "Withdrawn pending review," Burke said. "You'll return to your previous assessment level until the review is complete. Expect 4 to 6 weeks. He paused. I've also spoken personally to Elias Crum and Frank Della. Their situations will be addressed in the review. The sitting room was quiet. Chester, Gideon said. Burke's expression did not change, but something in it settled. The look of a man who had had a difficult conversation and was reporting its results without editorializing. Chester has submitted a letter to the commission indicating that he intends to withdraw from his seat at the end of the current term, Burke said. His letter cites the demands of his business interests. Souter, who had not spoken yet, said, he saw the documentation. Yes, Burke said, he did. And he understood that if the review found what it was going to find, Souter continued, and if that went to the state office, his name was going to be on something that didn't just involve county politics. He paused. Chester Drum is many things. Reckless isn't one of them. He knows when a position isn't tenable. Margaret looked at the two men across from her. He'll still own his land, she said. He'll still be a large presence in this county. Yes, Burke said. He will. We're correcting a process problem, not... He stopped. We can only do what the evidence supports. I know, she said. I'm not asking for more than that. Burke looked at her for a moment with an expression she hadn't seen from a Caldwell County man before. Not assessment, not skepticism, not the polite tolerance of someone waiting for her to finish speaking. Something closer to genuine regard. You've done good work here, Mrs. Ellison, he said. Careful work, the kind that holds up. She nodded. She did not make anything of it. After Burke and Souter left, the ranch was very quiet. Gideon sat in the sitting room for a few minutes without moving, and Margaret let him have that, because she understood what it meant to have a thing you've been braced against for weeks suddenly resolve. The particular disorientation of tension releasing, the way your body doesn't quite know what to do with the space where the pressure was. Eventually, he came to the kitchen. It's over, he said. This part of it, she said. Chester will recalibrate. He'll find a different approach in a year or two, when people have moved on. Probably, Gideon said. But you'll know what to look for, she said. And the commission will be watching differently. And Burke knows what it means to let something happen in front of him without seeing it. She poured coffee. Situations like Chester Drum don't end. They just change shape. What changes is whether you're prepared. He took the coffee. He looked at her. Stay, he said. It was a single word, and it was not a romantic declaration, and neither of them pretended it was. It was the direct statement of a man who had thought about what he was saying and had decided to say it plainly, rather than wrap it in anything it didn't need. I've been thinking about how to ask you properly, he said. I don't have a proper way. I have... He stopped, started again. What I have is this ranch. What I've got are the problems it comes with and the work it takes and 2 winters before it's operating the way it should be, if we do everything right and the weather cooperates and nothing else goes sideways. He set his mug down. And I have the honest knowledge that this place runs better with you in it, that I think better with you here, that the men work better, that I look at problems differently. He paused. That's not nothing. No, she said. It's not. I'm not going to tell you I can offer you something easy, he said. I can offer you something real, which I think is what you actually want. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the platform at Caldwell Station, which was 2 months ago, and felt longer than that. Not because so much time had passed, but because so much had happened. The particular compression of a period in which everything moves fast and matters. She thought about the list she'd made, and the 4th option she'd crossed out, and the word she'd written at the end, done. I'll need the east bedroom window fixed, she said, the sash rope. I've been living with it stuck open 2 inches since October. Something moved across Gideon's face. The thing that might have been a smile, this time it went all the way. I'll fix it tomorrow, he said. Today, she said. He fixed it that afternoon. She could hear him working at it while she balanced the November accounts at the kitchen table. The sounds of a man doing careful work at something small. The particular sounds of a household being maintained, which is different from the sounds of a household being managed, and better. The Henderson parcel was fully integrated by the end of November. Gideon brought the north herd down to the lower pasture for winter, and the hollow that had sheltered 30 cattle through the October storm became a point of reference in their planning conversations. The kind of place that has a story attached to it now, that means something specific to the people who were there when the story happened. The Harmon feed contract renegotiation held. The grain cooperative noticed, eventually, that they hadn't gotten Gideon Hale's account and sent a representative out in December with a revised offer. Margaret met with him at the kitchen table and negotiated a supplementary arrangement that gave them the cooperative's pricing on certain seasonal goods without abandoning the Harmon relationship. The representative went back to town having agreed to terms that had not been his opening position, and he told Ada at the records office, who told Orville Sparks, who told anyone who passed through the station, that the woman out at the Hale Ranch was not someone you wanted to negotiate against without preparation. The assessment review concluded in January. The Hale Ranch returned to its previous rate. Crum and Della received corrections going back 14 months. Chester Drum's 2 downward revised assessments were returned to standard rate, which cost him more annually than any of the increases had cost his neighbors, which was not precisely justice, but was the kind of mathematical irony that Margaret found quietly satisfying. Chester Drum did not come back to the Hale Ranch. He did not send messages or make offers or leave anything at the entrance to the lane. He existed in Caldwell County as he always had, large, present, operating, but with the particular recalibration of a man who has tested a border and found it solid. He would look for other angles. Margaret knew that, but he would not find this one available again. Elias Crum came by the ranch in February, the first time he'd been by in years, and sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and talked with Margaret and Gideon for an hour about soil conditions and spring planning, which was the conversation of neighbors. He brought a jar of his wife's preserved plums, which he set on the table without ceremony and didn't mention again, and Margaret understood this for what it was. A man's way of saying thank you when he wasn't going to say it directly. Frank Della sent a note. 3 lines. It said that his February assessment had come back at the corrected rate and that he was obliged, and that he hoped the spring came early. Margaret wrote back 4 lines, which said that she hoped the same, and that the spring usually did what it wanted regardless of what anyone hoped, but that hoping seemed worthwhile anyway. The next train arrived in March carrying new passengers to the territory. Not a bride train, just the ordinary spring movement of people toward possibility, toward land and work, and the versions of their lives they were still in the process of building. Margaret was in Caldwell that day for the grain cooperative meeting, and she saw the train come in from across the street, and she watched the people climb down onto the platform with their trunks and their particular expressions of exhaustion and alertness that people wear when they've arrived somewhere they're not sure of yet. She thought about herself on that platform 6 months ago. The trunk. The list. The 4th option, crossed out. She thought about what she would tell a woman who was standing where she had stood, who had arrived somewhere that had not yet decided what it was going to mean, who was looking at a situation that had gone wrong before it started and was trying to determine what to do with the remainder of the day. She would tell her, make the list, cross out going backward. Give the situation 24 hours before you decide what it is. She would tell her, the people who look at you and see a problem are almost always looking at you too quickly. Let them. Your job is not to correct their impression. Your job is to know your own worth with enough certainty that their impression becomes irrelevant. She would tell her, find out what is real, the work, the land, the accounts, the problems that actually need solving. Real things are more navigable than imagined things, even when they are harder. And she might tell her something else, something she had not expected to learn, coming out here with her trunk and her list and her practical intentions. That the things worth building take longer than you expect and look less like the plan than you thought they would, and that this is not failure. This is just the nature of things worth building. The plan is where you start. What you end up with is shaped by everything the plan didn't account for. The storms that come early, the men who come back when they should have kept driving, the bankers who listen when you speak the right language, the neighbors who hand you a document without asking for anything in return. You can't plan for any of that. You just have to stay. Gideon was waiting with the wagon when she finished at the cooperative. He had come into town for something, supplies, she thought, though she'd check the receipt later, and had timed it to meet her, which he did sometimes without making a point of it. She climbed up beside him, and he turned the wagon toward the ranch, and the March wind was cold, but had a different quality than October's wind. Less threat in it, more movement. The land on either side of the road was still brown and flat and wide, but there was something in the quality of the light that said it was thinking about changing. Kansas Light did that. It changed its mind slowly, but you could see the decision forming if you paid attention. They drove for a while without talking. She had her notebook open on her lap and was writing the cooperative meeting notes while they moved, because the ride was long enough and she was accustomed to working in motion. After a while, Gideon said, "Burke asked me something today." She looked up. "When did you see Burke?" "At the hardware. I was picking up the hinge hardware for the south barn." He kept his eyes on the road. "He asked me if we were planning to get married." The wagon moved steadily. The horse knew the road home. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "I told him I didn't know," he said, "that it wasn't something we'd discussed." "We haven't," she said. "No," he said, "we haven't." She looked at the road ahead of them. The ranch would be visible in another 10 minutes, the house first, and then the barn, and then the fence lines that were all properly posted now, and the north pasture where the Henderson cattle were grazing with the Hale cattle, and the two herds had spent 3 months becoming indistinguishable. "It seems like a reasonable next step," she said, "practically speaking." "It does to me," he said. "The accounts would be simplified," she said. "They would," he said. His voice had something in it, not quite that suppressed laugh, but related to it. "And the legal position on the property is cleaner," she said. "It is," he said. "So," she said. "So," he said. They drove another minute in silence. "Was that a yes?" he asked. She looked at him sidelong. He was looking at the road, but the corner of his mouth was doing the thing it did. "It was a practical assessment of the situation," she said, "which is how I say yes." He nodded. He reached over without looking at her and put his hand over hers, briefly. The way you put your hand on something you're glad is there. Not dramatically, not with performance, just honestly. Then he put his hand back on the reins because the road required both hands. She looked back at her notebook. She wrote one line at the bottom of the cooperative notes, beneath the figures and the supply terms and the delivery schedule. It said, "Spring." That was all. Just the word. The single fact of what was coming and what was already here, and what had been built out of a list with a fourth option crossed out in a platform at a train station, and two people who had both been looking for something real and had found it in the least likely arrangement, imperfectly, without poetry, through arguments about tax methodology and fence posts and who should have told whom what before telling a banker. Not the story either of them had planned. Better than the story either of them had planned. The ranch came into view as the wagon crested the low rise. The house first, the way it always appeared, and then the barn, and then Pete visible at the water trough doing exactly what needed doing, and Cass at the fence line because Cass was always at the fence line, and the smoke from the kitchen stove rising straight up into the still cold air of a March afternoon that was already, cautiously, thinking about becoming something warmer. Margaret closed her notebook. She looked at what the remaining years of her life had decided to become, out here on the flat and wide and cold and difficult land that didn't care what you'd planned but would work with you honestly if you showed up and paid attention. She found it was enough. More than enough. She found it was exactly what she had come for, even if she hadn't known how to name it when she left Ohio with a trunk and a list, and the stubbornness to cross out going backward. Some people spend their whole lives waiting to be chosen by the right circumstances. Margaret Ellison had learned at 56, on a dusty Kansas platform while strangers laughed at her age, that the more reliable approach was simply to choose, to look at what was real and difficult and possible and stay with it, to do the work that the work required, and to trust that the life worth having was not the one that arrived without friction, but the one that was built in spite of it. She had stayed. That had been the whole thing, in the end. She had stayed.